Good evening, everybody. I am Jacqueline Terraza, and I'm the Carolyn Musi Director of the Colby College Museum of Art, and we are live streaming tonight from 18 Main Street in downtown Waterville, the location of a new hub for arts collaboration here in the vicinity of Colby College in Waterville, Maine. We are joined tonight by in-person and especially by virtual audiences, and I'm so glad that so many of you could join us this evening for this conversation. Just a couple of housekeeping notes before we get started. For those of you joining us virtually, there is closed captioning, and you can enable that on the bottom of your Zoom screen by tapping on the closed captioning button. And then for those who want to submit questions on the, please do so on the Q&A box of your Zoom screens. And then at the end, when we have the Q&A portion, I'll be reading out from your questions. Today's conversation explores how the artist Anne Millet uses photography and film to examine the impact, the consequences, and the representation of war and governmental systems of control. The forced control and takeover of land, of resources, and people exacts human and environmental costs that last for decades and in fact centuries. And I acknowledge that I speak from the unceded territory of the Wabanaki Confederacy, which encompasses the Abenaki, the Maliseet, the Mi'kmaq, the Passamaquoddy, and the Penobscot nations. I express my respect to these Indigenous communities, past, present, and future, and our shared commitment to continue strengthening relationships between Colby and the Wabanaki people. The Miles and Katharine Culbertson Prentice Distinguished Lecture is presented by the Colby Museum with the support of the Department of Art and Friends of Art. This lecture series was established in April of 2016 to enable the museum to bring artists to campus whose work is featured in the Colby Museum's exhibitions and collections. We all very much look forward to returning to in-person, fully in-person events in the near future. However, I'm very glad that this is in fact not Anne Millet's first experience with Colby. In 2009, Professor Gary Green, who in fact joins us tonight in conversation, invited her to speak on campus. And that same year, the museum acquired 3 works of art by Anne. So tonight, 11 years later, we have the opportunity to see her work and her practice now, and to also reflect on connections between those earlier practices and her current work. Anne Millet was born in Saigon and fled with her family in 1975 at age 15, eventually settling in the United States. Today, she is professor of photography at Bard College, but in fact, she did not start her education on the path to photography. She received a Bachelor's of Applied Science and Master's degree in Science in Biology from Stanford University in 1981 and 85, and then 8 years later, she returned to school and completed her MFA at the Yale School of Art. She has published 2 monographs, Small Wars and Events Ashore, and in 2020, the Carnegie Museum of Art presented her first career retrospective. Uncontested Terrain was the title. Anne Millet's work is included in major museum collections, including Colby's, and has been recognized with multiple awards, including the MacArthur Foundation Fellowship, the Tiffany Comfort Foundation Fellowship, the National Science Foundation Awards, Antarctic Artists and Writers Program Award, and the John Simon Guggenheim Memorial Foundation Fellowship. She will be joined by Gary Green. Gary's my colleague and associate professor of art at Colby College, where he has taught photography since 2007. He received his MFA from Bard College, and his work is held also in multiple collections, including Colby's, the Rhode Island School of Design's Museum, the Portland Museum of Art in Oregon, as well as the Portland Museum of Art in Maine, the Amon Carter Museum, and many of the other museums here in the States. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Gary and to Anne Millet. We're so glad to join you here tonight and look forward to it.
Thank you so much, Jackie. That's a really nice introduction, and it's my pleasure. I appreciate being invited to do this and to reconnect with you on me after your visit in 2009, which was terrific. And I feel like my students had a great experience working with you and having you see their work. And as I recall, you brought prints, silver prints, and shared them with the class too, and that was really special. At the time, it was very difficult, I remember, for you for us to organize it, because that's about the time that you were starting to do these trips for events ashore. You could be called at any moment, I think, to go on a ship, and you'd have to cancel, and we agreed to that, or postpone, and we agreed to that, and we were lucky that you were able to make it. So I just wanted to say that we're going to start with the, anyway, it's an honor to have you here, and just, it's a great privilege. Thank you, thank you. We're going to start with Anmi's newest work, Silent General, and particularly fragments from that work. And then after that, we're going to go back to the beginning of her earlier work that she's known for and move on from there forward, so just so you know. So we're going to go to the first slide. This is a photograph you made on the set of Free State of Jones, a movie starring Matthew McConaughey by director Gary Ross, is it, I think?
Yes, correct. But quickly, I wanted to thank you and Jacqueline for this great invitation, and I really wish I could be there in person. I've loved visiting Colby. Yes, this was a picture made in 2015, and this is when Silent General was started. I can't believe it's been 6 years. I guess you could subtract 1.5 because of COVID. But I had just finished Events Ashore, so this is a project that we'll see later and that Gary mentioned. And in between projects, it's always very difficult to a difficult time, always wondering what is coming up next. And so I received this invitation by Gary Ross to come and photograph on his film set, to photograph, and particularly the trench battles here, the Battle of Corinth. I love the pictures. I love being on the set. You know, it was a bit nerve-wracking because I had never worked on such a huge big budget film before. And in the end, I realized that it was very much like working with the military, you know, things I repeated more than once, things are actually pretty slow. You know, you stop for an hour, half hour to adjust the light, something happens. There are opportunities to really do something great with a view camera, which is what I work, and it's a camera on tripod and slow shutter speed. Yeah, I learned to navigate the set and love the pictures, but felt that it was not enough for a project. At the same time, I was also invited to do a small commission in the south of the United States, and Silent General, the Matthew McConaughey film was also shot in Louisiana. So for this other commission, I decided to return to New Orleans, where I had done a little bit of work. And this happened to be at the time when Confederate monuments were being contested. And I decided to photograph those. And very quickly, I realized that there was a dialogue that was going on between the photographs in the film set and the monuments. And that sort of helped me figure out that this was a new project. There were a lot of topics that were being discussed. The presidential election from 2016 was gearing up, and it was also very fraught. Notions about immigration, talks of white supremacy, election rights. Everything was so simplified and so fraught that I felt that it needed to be explored with complexity. And I decided that that was going to be my new project. I think that if we move to the next slide, you'll see a photograph of the one of the Confederate monuments as it was being contested.
Yeah, I was going to say, so this idea you entitled Silent General, and I'd like to, you know, for folks who don't know, was taken from a book called Specimen Days by Walt Whitman. And you call these sort of sections of photographs fragments, and I was thinking it's really the perfect name for the group, and it's also for photography. It's kind of perfect too. I mean, because the pictures, we take all these fragments that are within the frame and try to make them into a readable picture, and then you have a single picture, and then you think, well, okay, that's just a fragment of the narrative. So I think it's a perfect title, and so I'd like to know how you got there. Well, about the title, Silent General, and then fragments, and also how you got there after this really epic project, Events Ashore. I guess it seems like it started with the film and then the work in Louisiana. But I'd like you to talk a little bit more about that, about this work, and we'll kind of go through a couple of the pictures as you do. I think that would be nice.
Yeah, thank you. I think often processes get resolved because of practical problems that arise, and sometimes they come because we're interested in specific ideas. So for me, it was a mixture. I think I was at a point in my life when I felt that I was not so bound by either a location or a type of pictures or a kind of subject matter, such as the military or naval, coastal operations all over the world. And I was also bound by the notion that I would be showing this work within a year at the Whitney Biennial, and I would have a certain amount of space. I felt that I wanted to say something substantial. And so I worked around this idea of stringing together a number of pictures. And the pictures seemed so disparate at the time when I started. You know, some of them are from film sets, other are from real life. It seems so disparate, and how could they come together? And I think the notion of the essay, the notion of asking a question and perhaps developing certain thoughts, but not necessarily coming up with an answer towards the end was sort of my model. I also was looking for a title and came across Walt Whitman's Specimen Days and loved the notion of the silent general. It seems so specific to some pictures, but also so evocative and could be referring to other works in this series. And I kind of grabbed onto it. Silent General is actually the title of one of the short essays. And this is something that Whitman wrote towards the end of his life. It's the most autobiographical work. It's prose. I was drawn to it because it's very descriptive, and you know, Whitman was a journalist. He worked for the Book and Eagle, so the language is incredibly descriptive in the way photography is, and I was very drawn to that. So Silent General is actually Ulysses Grant, and he's referring to him as a somewhat average man who was a great general and rose up to being a very good president, it seems. And I just love that idea of someone somewhat average outdoing himself. And I kind of took that title. So the pictures are kind of put together in a kind of loose way. So here you have a little bit of a lot, actually a lot about the racial strife that was going on at the time, the notion of racial justice, of history, of the United States not continuing to celebrate these dark moments in our history. This picture was taken the day after the election, the next morning in New Orleans as well. I like the fact that it's not mentioning who the president is, because it could be referring to many presidents in our history. And so this fragment sort of shifts back in time in terms of speaking about history, speaking about the current moment, and also speaking about everyday life in the South, particularly in New Orleans.
It's so interesting, and Whitman seems like such a perfect person to have pulled from, given his interest in photography and the democracy of photography and the details that a photograph can describe. We could go down so many avenues right now, I feel like, but I wonder how a picture like this, which seems more, although you said there's some ambiguity, and I thought that when I saw it, because I immediately looked for the date, and I thought, who's that about? And but I wonder if pictures like this also give you a certain license to include pictures that are more, I wouldn't say they're bucolic, but they're maybe even more open-ended. For instance, well, not so much this one, but the swamp, say in Louisiana, that is really hard to read if you're just looking at that picture. So I like
Right, right.
these political pictures or more political pictures that kind of open it up to a little bit broader type of landscape.
Yeah, so I think that it's the way they work together, so you're right in that having something so specific and more trenchant, um, speaking about the newly or about a president, allows me to actually uh, indulge a bit in something that's more beautiful, even though I was attracted to this because of the notion of the swamp, and it's a word that was thrown around so much.
Right.
And I was so interested in what it represented and what it has been representing. And so I think the titles are very simple and very straightforward and kind of nerdy, but they do cue you in a bit in terms of the double meaning and um, what I was trying to imply as well.
That's actually, I have to admit that I didn't think of Drain the Swamp when I saw the swamp. I just thought how beautiful the swamps are in Louisiana, but it's kind of perfect. So you started photographing some of these monuments that had been removed also as part of these fragments. And well, a couple things, just like, one thing, just kind of dealing with logistics. Was it easier to get this kind of access because of the work you've done with the military? Was it easier, harder? How do you go about doing that? I think people would love to know how you managed to get in these spaces like this.
Well, I think that in a way it was easier and in a way it was more difficult. I think when I was working with the military, I sort of knew who I should go to. Um, and just hope for the best. And I think here it's there's so much freedom, there's so many options that you just have to try every possible venues and just hope for the best that something would come through. I mean, I felt so fortunate that a friend of a friend of a friend was able to just get me into these Homeland Security storage to photograph these monuments. I just thought it was so miraculous. I actually tried to photograph those monuments being torn down, but ultimately I missed those opportunities. And so I was able to, it was very lucky that I was able to get into the storage.
Sorry about that. It's a little slideshow I did. I was looking for the other monument.
Oh, it's the other direction.
Yeah, it's in the, oh, we already, did we?
Yeah, we passed through
Oh, I
it.
passed it when I was moving forward the last time. Let's go back. Well,
Yeah, this is not the same monument, but it is one of the monuments that was being contested. Yeah.
somehow I thought we had the photograph of Robert E. Lee.
Oh, the vertical.
Maybe we don't have it in here. I've been looking at so many different books and things, and I thought it was in this, but forgive me. So, let's see. I'm thinking different things, and when I look at your work, I think of Robert Adams, a photographer we both admire, and I know he can make beautiful pictures of the prairie or in his backyard, but he also turns up the heat a little bit when he photographs things that he's a little more angry about. And I wondered, such as Turning Back and What We Bought, groups of work like that. And I wonder how that feeling or that idea, if you think that's very common in your work. In other words, we'll look at some older work, but, kind of balancing between what you can what's beautiful and what is positive and hopeful. And then when you feel you have to kind of make a point, is that something that occurs to you that you change tactics slightly?
Yeah, I do. I don't think that I'm trying to change anybody's mind or I'm not. I feel a certain way. And I think in the past, I've felt distraught about certain things, such as us invading Iraq. I think for this project, I was probably more angry than distraught, and felt that an urgency in making this work. But I'm not making this work to change people's mind. I don't think that I'm that kind of photographer. I'm not an activist. For me, it's always to raise the question and to point something out and provide some answers, but not necessarily the answer. Because I think everything is really complicated, and these subjects should be approached in a complicated way. And I certainly don't have the answer, and I certainly don't want to be right about any of this. But I think the important issues that need to be explored, and I do believe that we can do it with photography and simple titles. And I felt that being able to string these pictures together also allowed me a certain freedom to be able to um, speak more broadly, and I think have a greater stage in the sense that it's just not a single image or a series of pictures, but being able to put together something that can question and make people reconsider things.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Um, let's see. A picture like this, I wanted to talk about a little bit. This and the other picture of the workers, because I think one of the topics you're taking on with this work, labor, immigration, things like that. And it seems like in both cases, with this picture and then the one in the fields, there's sort of this sense of anonymity, and I wonder if that's something you thought of, or how it's such a difficult thing, I think, to make a picture of somebody working and have it go beyond just the simple notion. And I think that's the big picture that your pictures take on. That's the you take on these big questions, and something has to do with your equipment. You're photographing with the large format and the amount of detail you can show. But I wondered if you thought about sort of not showing the faces, if that was critical, or if that's just how it worked out.
Well, I think, as you know, when you actually photograph and you work so intuitively, um, that certain notions don't necessarily register, and you just sort of go with the flow. But I think I knew that this picture would not be a portrait of the laborers. It was a portrait about the work that they do. It was so important to me. And I think that it was more important to showcase that than to showcase them specifically, because they all have important individual stories. But I wanted to perhaps talk about the notion that they were replaceable, and that they're kind of this anonymous workforce that we don't even think about. And that's why we talk about building a wall, when no one's considering the importance of the criticality of the work they do. And so, that's where the problem lies, not in building the wall. That's not going at the root of the problem. But I wanted to showcase the difficult work that is being done here. I never knew how asparagus were harvested, and after I saw them do this, I just thought, oh my God, this is incredible. And so, I wanted to emphasize the curve of their back, how low they had to go. And you can't really tell from the slide, but they have a knife that's attached to a stick, and that's how they lobe off the asparagus, the stalk, from the ground. And then they have to pick it up and put them in those baskets. So it's incredible work, and yes, I wanted to talk about that. Um, and I think in the same way, um, previously in the other photograph, I think that I didn't really want to show their face, because there's also that notion that the immigrant or the day worker who was not necessarily legal, didn't really want to be known. So it was about that notion of uh, being an anonymous worker as well.
So this is such an interesting picture. High school students, 4th of July celebration. Um, this is has to be sort of somewhat staged in the sense of, your big camera. And so you reached out. What was this like? I mean, this seems like a very difficult photograph to make. What was it like? How did it occur, and what was it like to make it?
So this happened during the summer when Charlottesville happened and 2017. So we have had a new president for a while. I think everyone was so upset, angry, and distraught. And I came back to New Orleans to photograph those monuments in storage. And on 4th of July, I thought that going down to Bayou St. John would be a great place to find people celebrating or just hanging out. And I came across, I first noticed the young woman on the right and started photographing her. And then I turned around and noticed the other two. And I realized that that was where the picture laid and kind of set it up. And they're very good friends. And I think that the dynamics between them um, was very hopeful for me. You know, I found great comfort in experiencing this moment. In a way, I sort of concocted it, but it really existed. So I feel, um, you know, very good about it.
It's a picture of hope among some of the other things that maybe are less so, would you
I mean,
say?
I think, yeah, I don't think that it simplifies the notion of uh, racial relations, but I think it's definitely a picture of hope.
This one, you're quite far away, and I really, you constantly, or not constantly, you very steadfastly talk about yourself as a landscape photographer, which you are, but you include people, and as you did with some of the earlier work, which we'll see. So this picture, you're quite far away, but they must be aware of you too. So is there a relationship there? How does that come about?
But this was actually quite far away, and I don't think they could hear me. So no instructions. This was just very spontaneous. I made this picture, and it's kind of a continuation of the issues surrounding immigrations and the wall. So this is on the border of Texas and Mexico, and the wall, the bridge is the international bridge, and uh, the the border close, the side of the river close to us is Mexico, and the other side is the United States. And a lot of Mexicans come to the river during the summer when it's really hot, and it's a point of entertainment to get less heat. And this family was swimming and getting cooled off. But for me, it just brought up the memories of those pictures of families crossing the border and drowning. And I think I found great comfort again in seeing this tight family unit under this bridge. And for me, it's like a symbol of um, the kind of exchange that should be going on. And that notion that we have an immigration problem and it needs to be solved. Um, so that's what this picture is for me.
Yeah, it seems very peaceful. It seems like a family being out there enjoying the day, but it's hard to say. But
It's
that's
hard to say.
the
They could be drifting as well. Yes.
yeah, that's
Yeah.
that's important. So then there's these two pictures of the border guards, two women, and from the American side and from the Mexican border. So I'm assuming this was. It seems like you treated them very carefully to be photographed the same way and to show them as women who were, military again, once again, that job. What are your thoughts about these two pictures? Was there something more than that, or um, there are many pictures that we'll see, or a few that we'll see, but many pictures in your earlier work of women in the military, and I'm just curious what you think about that, about the women that you've made portraits of.
I spent a little over a week down there, and this is near Marfa, and I think the problem was what kind of picture could I make that would be speaking about this border and the connection between Texas and Mexico, and that sort of organic life that flows back and forth, and what is happening with the Trump immigration laws at that point in time. And it seemed to me, and I kept seeing these women working, and it seemed to me that they could be they could speak so in interesting ways about that notion of the other. And it's a non-binary option, of course. I love the fact that they represent power and authority. And this woman is Mexican American. Actually, so she was originally Mexican, and then the other one is 100% Mexican still. But they just are separated by this yellow line, and in a way they are so close together but so far apart. I guess I wanted to talk about how precarious the whole thing is as well, because it seems that it's all hung on this uniform and this yellow line. Um, so, it's, I think we all have, we come up with different visual solutions to try to talk about what interests us. And this was my solution.
Right.
Um,
Moving on, we'll look at a few more of these, and I think we should move along to the earlier work. So these are more of the fragments. The White House.
and these are more recent around elections and during COVID.
Yeah,
You
right.
know, this is about the theater in not just the Trump White House. I think any White House. How information is processed and disseminated, but particularly in the Trump White House, how reality and theater all just came together, and there was no fine line between the two. Um, I was so distraught about what was happening with the postal service and mail-in ballots. So I found in the next slide, um, uh, I met up with this postal worker and kind of followed her around and was able to photograph her right here. But I love this way of working. There's so much more freedom. Um, Anything's possible, but at the same time, it's also very stressful to think about how am I responding to a current event and what is the picture or what are the pictures that I should be making in response.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's a beautiful picture, and again, I love the openness of it. The guy who's walking the dog is, he's not really responding in any way that you can be that's clear. And obviously, the postal worker, the woman, is responding very sort of, gently toward the dog. It kind of again seems like maybe it's a hopeful picture. It seems like maybe maybe it's 2020 and people are outside. I don't know. It's still during the pandemic, but it's human connection, and it seems like polite and warm.
Yeah, and usually, there are all these tales of dogs running after postal workers and being really aggressive. So I just love that this happened, and it was really unexpected. Unexpected. It was a real gift.
That's great. All the dogs in the world, thank you for disproving that cliche. So let's go back to the first work you made that most people know. I mean, you made work before this, but this is postgraduate school, yes, and Vietnam. You started in the 90s, 93 or 94, when you went back to Vietnam, where you had left when you were, I think, 15 or 16. Is that right? Or
Yes, yes.
yeah. So it's the first time back since then. And talk about this work a little bit. First, this photograph, unlike the rest of that work, is not a landscape. And if you could talk about that a little bit, and
Yeah,
then
so
onto the land.
this was made during graduate school. And I think that the turning point for me in graduate school was that the notion of making work that is autobiographical came up, and the question for me was, well, how do I do that? You know, I wish I could return to Vietnam and explore the notion of my origins. And at the time, there was no diplomatic relations with Vietnam, and as Vietnamese Americans, we could not travel there. So I looked around, and the only photographs I could find are actually photographs that were made during the colonial times, and probably by French photographers, of this is, I think, the Emperor's Child, perhaps, and the city of Hue. Um, I looked in various archives, could not find any other photographs except photographs of war or these particular photographs. So I think that when we were able to return to Vietnam, and even though my original idea was to collect objects and other photographs to continue with these still lives, I immediately responded to the landscape, and and um, and started becoming a landscape photographer. I think that so much of this work has to do with um, giving voice to the notions of memories. You know, I think living in exile um, makes you have these memories that are probably fabricated. You know, certain things are exaggerated. You forget other things, and some of these landscapes just really dovetailed with notions of what it was like to grow up in the countryside, the notion of scale, the notion of history, all of that was in the landscape, and that's what these pictures are about. There are a lot of photographs of children as well.
I'm sorry?
There are also a lot of photographs of children
Ah,
um,
yeah.
in these. Because I think I kind of saw myself in them. You know, they're very idiosyncratic. This is a small family garden of betel leaves, and my grandmother used to chew the nuts and the leaves, and I never saw how they were grown, and this was such a garden. And so I asked this mother and daughter who lived in the house to pick the leaves.
Somebody once told me that that our bodies don't forget anything, that we have physical memory of places even if we're not conscious. I don't know if that's true, but I like that notion. I'd like to think that as a photographer, there's that's something we can pull out. You know, going back to a place that we may not remember, but somehow feels our body feels something else. Is that possible?
I think absolutely. I do think that those feelings are completely fabricated, but it doesn't matter. I think we have them and we cherish them. And if we can connect, if something can connect us to those emotions and those feelings and those remembrances, you know, I think it's a really wonderful thing. And these pictures for me did that. And so I was actually really relieved after making this work, and I felt that um, I could live anywhere. And I think that this body of work also made me understand that um, I was not necessarily Vietnamese or American, that I was an artist first and foremost.
We're moving now to small wars, these next photographs. And so after coming back from Vietnam, somebody contacted you or something like that. Is that right? I can't quite recall the story. How did you end up photographing these enactors in the first place?
Well, it was obvious that during the whole time I was working in Vietnam, I had avoided anything directly related to war, and there was a subject that I had to tackle. So, as excuse Um, so, as a photographer who likes to work in the real world, it was so difficult to think of something that could help me go back in time. And a friend of mine met someone who'd been photographing reenactors, and found out through that person that there existed a new breed of reenactors, not just Civil War, World War II, but Vietnam War reenactors. This was the beginning of the internet, and I spent some time doing some research and found a group that reenacted in the summertime in North Carolina and Virginia. And so I contacted them and decided to go down, and I never quite knew at first what kind of work it would be, but I quickly realized that um, it was a work that allowed me to explore the notion of Vietnam as and the war as an idea and as a myth, and I realized that a lot of these young men were too young to have been old enough to, of course, go to Vietnam or even know much about the war through the news. But it was their knowledge was all through movies, through literature, and it was such a myth that was growing in their mind, and I wanted to tap into that.
Well, there's such a generosity to the work because the first it would be very easy to feel like why are you reenacting something that was so awful that
So
you weren't
controversial.
around to
Yeah.
see, and not only that, when we come to a picture like this, you were even willing to go further and participate. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it was a requirement. You have to participate in order to be there, and I was willing to do it. And I think that at first I used to think that they were a little cuckoo, you know. Um, and at the time, this was before we invaded Iraq, and the notion of guns and people running around with guns was unheard of. I was actually a little reticent to speak about this project, but obviously now, I mean, you look at what happened on January 6th, and I actually think, looking back now, these guys are actually very sweet. I don't think any of them were up at the Capitol protesting and barging in and breaking windows. But I think everything is relative in time. I think that they really love the history, and I think that maybe they wanted something more novel, and World War II was so reenacted that they um, settled on Vietnam, and they reenacted both sides. So I was not the only Viet Cong. I had a contingency of Viet Cong with me, and then we had the GIs. And actually, I think that the Viet Congs in the North Vietnamese Army were sort of the hero, because we were always humping. We were more resourceful, and it was more fun on our side,
Well, it is kind
if
of.
such a thing could be said about playing war.
Yeah. Let me see. This is still Small Wars. Um, this could be war. This could be real war when you look at it. But I know what I was drawn to when I first saw this work in Small Wars was just how gorgeous these were. I mean, they're beautiful photographs, and I think that's sort of the success of them, is that you give us so much visual pleasure that with the content, I think these photographs just pull us in very slowly. You don't even have to know what they're about at first, and then you get pulled in. And I think that's so much comes down to what I try to teach as well. There's so much integrity to the photograph themselves, and that if you can accomplish that, then you're pulled into the story. And that's what I think of this work, is like you can't help but be curious, because the pictures are, they're just the detail, the beauty, the light on the leaves with the little children in the garden, and even the beautiful pyrotechnical, display in the sky as awful as that is, and as much as it reminds me of the Iraq War and seeing the missiles flying at night, there's a kind of beauty. Is that something that you embrace or something that you balance?
Well, it's something that always made me uncomfortable until I settled on that notion of the sublime and something, you know, those recent pictures you showed are photographs of the Marines training in 29 Palms outside of Los Angeles
Mhm.
um, in the desert before they get sent off to Iraq.
Right.
So it's kind of a fake Afghanistan. It's live fire and it's hardcore training. But at the same time, it's fairly safe. I had a flak jacket, I had a helmet. I was somewhat far away. Um, and so it has to do with being terrified, but also knowing that you're somewhat safe. And it's about the ineffable. And, you know, it's so mysterious. And it's that transient notion of something that's beautiful, but also devastating. And you kind of uh, um, go from one to the other
Mm.
very quickly.
Yeah. So events ashore, which we'll look at briefly, and then we're going to go to some questions. Oh, actually, we're going to talk a little bit about your new work. But how did you come to this? So this is your first color photography project that we know, and it came about during the Iraq War. How did you begin this? Where did the ideas come from? How did you accomplish it?
Um, this project ideas are always very simple. Someone I met at 29 Palms invited me to visit them when they were training on a ship, and I was curious. I was also fascinated by the sea, being a landscape photographer. And this actually turned into a 9-year project. And I switched to color because um, we were often at sea on a very gray, overcast day, and I felt that black and white film could not distinguish between the subtleties and the grays, especially a warm gray, metallic gray versus something that's more organic. And so that kind of made me decide to switch to color. It was a difficult switch, but I think it took me a little bit of time, but I figured it out. I was so taken by all the women that I met in the military and the way they try to carve out their space while performing all the duties, and they were all, extremely competent, of course. The notion of the military preparing their messaging. Uh, um, this is in the portrait studio in an aircraft carrier. And so I learned that the Navy was all over the world doing supportive troops in the Gulf, um, supporting science in Antarctica or in Greenland, um, collecting information, doing humanitarian missions. They were everywhere doing everything. And that notion of the military industrial complex was so apparent. And I wanted to explore and be a witness to all of that. And I think what was difficult also was that this is happening in real time. There's no construct like it's training or it's reenactment. This is happening in real time. It's in color. So I had it was a big task to try to do this work and not make it photojournalism or distinguish it from photojournalism. Um, but I think that the lesson I learned in this work is that to embrace the contradictions. I was attracted to the gear. I was attracted to the hardcore stuff and being invited on the ship and being accepted. I love learning about the people who work there. But at the same time, I wanted to show the flaws and all the mismanagement and um, the notion of the lack of information. Sometimes, I mean, this diptych is about the fog of war. Um, the pictures in Guantanamo Bay. Um, it's subtle, but it's about embracing the contradictions. And then finally, um, towards the end, I stuck around long enough that the Americans actually returned to Vietnam and renewed relations militarily with the Vietnamese, which would have been unthinkable at some point. But they did, and they support each other now.
Yeah. I'm sorry to have to move along, running short on time, but it's ironic. I'll just say that I think this involved around 10 years of work. So it's, to squeeze it so tight, I'm sorry to do that.
No worries.
We'll move along. For anybody who has not seen the extent of this work, all of it, really go to the catalogs at least, or where you can see it in person, some of it at the Colby Museum of Art. But I think we have questions. Do we have time? I hope. Well, we could, yeah, I was interested in the new project that you're working on. And I thought maybe somebody would ask, well, what are you working on? And I could pull up this slide here of your embroidery. So maybe you could just tell us what this is, and then we could go to the questions.
So this is a bit of a side project that was started before quarantine, but it became, such a big thing during quarantine because I had so much more time. This is hopefully it will be a series of screenshots from a pornographic film from the 90s, an American pornographic film that I found from the 90s that involves men in the business of reenacting um, a GI platoon in the forest somewhere and encountering these two young Asian women who arrive on a red moped. So it was fascinating to me because it's I don't know much about pornography, but it's unusual that it involves landscape, right? So you see this man actually coming out of the forest dressed like my reenactors. The red moped comes from Full Metal Jacket, and then it's kind of a standard porn film. And I've kept this since the moment I found it for so many years, and settled on the fact that, well, perhaps I could just embroider some of these images and transform them. And embroidery is actually a very important craft in Vietnam. And I learned actually in French school, but then I had a refresher course more recently with some Vietnamese embroiderers. For me, it's interesting because it's about labor. It's about slowing down in the way these images are rendered, and war, sex and death. For me, it all goes together. And perhaps this is just, the next chapter to talk about it. I love Goya's disasters of war. Sometimes you see the bodies, and it's so hard to distinguish, to tease everything apart. And so these images sort of do that for me. It's very labor intensive. I'm learning about color theory. I'm not a painter. There's been a lot of taking the stitch out and starting again. But this is sort of what I've been doing during quarantine, besides photographing as well.
Beautiful. I turn it over to Jackie, and thank you so much, Anmi, for answering those questions.
Thank you for leading the discussion.
Yeah, it's been fantastic to hear you talk about your work and just this conversation, and have a couple of questions here. The first one is, you address many large topics such as immigration, war, presidential election, voting by mail. When photographing about these topics, do you have a vision or an idea of how do you want these photographs to look? Or do you photograph as they come to you, kind of as you encounter them?
Well, I think that there's no simple answer to that question. I think it really depends on what the issue is. And I think sometimes I spent a couple of weeks reacting to something and being completely abject and outraged. and thinking I need to respond and not knowing how to respond. And of course, my first reaction always is to be present and go and witness the event, which is not always possible. And I've learned that actually I shouldn't be there, uh, um, and that the best response is probably something more oblique. Um, and I think that in a way, I hope that my pictures sort of remind everyone how complicated the topic is, and I hope that the photograph presents some issues. I think that they are interpreted differently by different people, and that's okay with me. But ultimately, I think Gary has mentioned that I find comfort, and I think I have great belief in humanity. I have great belief that we'll get ourselves out of this mess, and it doesn't mean that everything should be brushed under the carpet. But I think that's what I hope my pictures do.
Thank you for that. The next one is perhaps more of a comment. There's an observation, and the person comments on how for instance, the custom officers, the U.S. officer, is kind of in the images about customs officers, the Mexican officer is unarmed, the U.S. officer is fully armed, and other images, for instance, the corporeal hopper at 29 Palms in the Colby's collection has two sidearms. So commenting on how our neighbors are perhaps less armed, less militarized than our own law enforcement officers. And just wondering if that is something that you notice as you were photographing the presence or absence of arms in the systems of control that happen, for instance, at the border or in any of the spaces that you find yourself in.
Well, I'm so great. I'm so great.
And actually, if we could switch to the image of me speaking from the image of the slide. Thank you.
Um, I think the sound is is this
There we go. Yeah. Can you hear us?
yes, yes, I can hear myself as well.
Good.
I think we're good now. So thank you for the comment. I think it makes me very happy that the photographs did the job and that these details are noticed. And I think my pictures are usually about a slow read, and hopefully I'm always hoping people will take the time to notice those details and think about what they mean, and they all mean something. I must say that I don't necessarily notice every single thing when I make a photograph and gauge what they represent and what they mean. I think it's impossible to do that. You just have to act very intuitively. I think I noticed in general that there were differences, but I didn't go into the details. You just have to worry about your frame, worry about so many other things. But yes, I think all those details matter. It's about description. It's about uh, showing that there's a history there that is complicated and everything means something. Um, yeah, I think that the United States is overly weaponized, and we know that. uh, I don't know how we got to this point. I mean, yes, I do know how we got to this point, but I don't think we seem to have learned, especially after the increased number of mass shootings that are happening. Um, there's a culture, that celebrate weapons, and it's about strength and it's about freedom, and it comes with our history, and the way. I think our country was born from that. So I hope that this will change. And certainly, you know, there are a number of topics in my head that I think about that I want to address. And hopefully, you know, I think that photograph, the first photograph of the young students protesting after the Stoneman Douglas shooting is certainly an attempt to do that. You know, I mean, photographs of protests have been overdone before, but I was hoping that one would work. Yeah.
Thank you. One last question. Could you speak to the difference between working and moving versus still images in terms of your approach?
Well, I have made only a couple of films, and they're silent. I would say, well, the sound, you know, photographs are not very generous. You know, they don't have sound, they don't smell, they don't move. So it's pretty sparse, and I think they require a lot from a viewer. And I'm always grateful that people would stop and spend the time and try to read through and understand what's going on, or try to interpret an image. But I do love film, and I do love being able to tell a story, you know, in a such a direct way.
Well, thank you so much, Amile, for joining us this evening. Hopefully, we will bring you back at some point to campus again. And thank you, Gary, for being part of this conversation, facilitating it, and being such a great colleague. And thanks to everybody who has joined us tonight for this conversation. Have a very good evening.
Thank
Thank
you
you,
so
Jackie,
much.
and thank
Thank you
you.
for coming.
I hope we see you up in Maine sometime
I'd love to
soon.
come. Yes. Have a great spring.
Thank you, you too.
Thank you.